Goosebumps. That final little image of Aerith at the end. That was really good. Wow. So about 4 months later, here I am seeing the credits of Final Fantasy VII roll. It's been a hell of an experience. It's been a great ride. Well, where to begin? Well, I guess I'll probably start at the most obvious point, because Final Fantasy VII has an enormous fan base. It's probably the biggest and most vocal fan base of the entire series. And I guess for me the biggest question was, by the time I got to the end of this, how did I feel about the game in terms of it living up to having that fan base and being such a legendary title? I think when it's all said and done, this game for me is definitely deserves its legendary status among the Final Fantasy games, because I think people have to kind of understand the difference between thinking a game is the best game and thinking a game is the greatest game, because in something that's like as subjective as video games, where everyone has their own tastes and preferences, and you know, there's a very heavy story element, there's all these characters and there's all this kind of stuff, it's very difficult to define objectively which game is the best. But when it comes to greatness, you know, greatness is something that I think in the world of video games is slightly easier to measure, and it has, you know, a way of being defined more easily than some of the other things. And when you look at Final Fantasy VII's fan base, how influential it is in the industry, how many games have been spun off from it, the film that's been made from it, you know, all the merch that gets sold. When you look up Final Fantasy merch, you know, you tend to see Final Fantasy VII to be sold the most or be offered the most. And I think having played it again, like having played the game properly for the first time in my life, I can definitely say that it deserves this legendary status, because I think when I look at it as a whole, and when I consider the time in which it was made, and you know, the time in which it came out, the games that were around at the time, the history of Square Enix up until that point, all this kind of stuff. Well, it wasn't called Square Enix then, but you get what I mean. I feel like this game just had so many of the right ingredients to make it great, because it done a lot of things really well. Like, would I say, for example, that it had the best soundtrack of the entire Final Fantasy series? No. But did it have a really good soundtrack, a really memorable soundtrack that had some definitely iconic tracks within them? You know, we literally just listened to one like 20 minutes ago with One Winged Angel and all that kind of stuff. So, for example, the soundtrack was up there as one of the best in my opinion. Probably like top 5 Final Fantasy soundtracks of all time. Likely to be top 3 if I really tried to sit down and, you know, think about it. So, you know, it's strong in that regard. If we're looking at like the story and the characters involved in it, legendary characters. I mean, Cloud is obviously a legendary character. Sephiroth is the most legendary antagonist of Final Fantasy that we've ever had, and again with good reason, because his story is very interesting. There's a lot to it. The battles with him are really cool. You know, he's got that iconic look. His scene with Aerith that really like cements him as like a really iconic villain. You know, all that kind of stuff. So that's definitely up there as one of the best. Gameplay wise, I think, you know, the world was quite wide. It had good variety. If we're talking about enemies, the enemy variety was good. The materia system I liked. It gave the game a lot of variety. You could mix and match in a lot of ways. You could, you know, it gave a lot of characters the freedom to do what they wanted, so they didn't really force you down a particular route. They tried their best to balance the game by giving like powerful materia's strongly negative HP effects and all that kind of stuff. I feel like in terms of those sorts of ingredients, I feel like it pretty much had everything you could ask for a game made. And for a game released in 1997 on the PS1, the first PS1 Final Fantasy ever made, I mean, I don't really know how much better they could have made it at the time, because, you know, I think up until then, Final Fantasy was probably, you know, a popular franchise, but it didn't really have like a global appeal and it wasn't really on the map in terms of like the gaming realm on a world stage. But Final Fantasy VII just changed everything, man. And when you look at it in those terms of like everything it's achieved, and the fact that even more than 20 years on, like someone like me who's played a lot of Final Fantasy games before this, who's played a lot more modern Final Fantasies before this, if I can sit down, play through this game, and say that I agree that it's one of the greatest games of all time, and agree that it probably deserves its status as the greatest Final Fantasy of all time, then, you know, that's saying something to the quality of the game. and to everything that it has. So I'm really glad that it didn't disappoint. Like, I didn't want to get to the end of this and say, you know what, I feel like Final Fantasy VII is a bit overrated, because of course, like, if you're looking at the extreme, you know, set of fans that are really just like, they would, you know, they live and die by Final Fantasy VII, then okay, that's a little bit extreme. But in terms of his general status, so if you ask just like a lot of either casual gamers or just like regular gamers, which Final Fantasy do you think is the greatest, they're likely to say Final Fantasy VII. And having played it, I think I will probably stand by that. As much as I have such a deep love for Final Fantasy X, and I personally think it's the best Final Fantasy game, but is it greater than Final Fantasy VII? I'd personally say no. I think Final Fantasy VII is genuinely the greatest Final Fantasy ever made. So, talking more deeply about the, you know, what I thought about the game and the experience and all that kind of stuff, I always enjoy these kind of stories because there was like a good mix of like a more scientific approach to life and to like existence and, you know, the planet and all that kind of stuff, but we also had the more magic, fantasy, metaphysical side to it as well, because I think that the game had a lot of kind of internal battles and personal struggles versus like the bigger picture of the planet and the world. And I think the ending demonstrated that really well, because, you know, we got the moment with Cloud and Sephiroth where Cloud finally got to vanquish his nemesis, but, you know, once it was over, it was like, well, okay, but, you know, that there is still this bigger thing going on in terms of like the entire planet and trying to save it and all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, Aerith comes in with the Holy, and just like her will and her desire and her love for the planet and the people within it and life in general was what ended up saving the planet, which I think was really, really cool. So even though she made the ultimate sacrifice and it was such a heartbreaking moment for so many of us watching the story, ultimately she is the true hero of the story because she gave everything in order to save the planet and for future generations to prosper. And I think Aerith in that sense was such a legendary character because Aerith's death is like the single most iconic Final Fantasy moment of all time. I think that's a difficult one to debate because it's just so memorable. Even people that haven't played Final Fantasy VII before will probably know about that scene and would have been spoiled about it at some point because it's so talked about and so iconic. And just the way I think the story came together, I did enjoy it because we had Cloud, who, you know, we had a certain opinion of Cloud and who he was, what his skills were, what his background was, and all that kind of stuff. 500 years later. That's a long time later, man. All of our protagonists are dead. Except maybe... Nanaki. They're known for their very long lives. And there he is. Leading the next generation. Your tail's on fire, bro. I'm not sure we saw any more of Nanaki's race. Like, we saw his father, like the fact that he was like petrified or like his statue or whatever. But we never saw any more of these guys. Ah. So Midgar no longer exists in its original form. Nature has reclaimed Midgar. To be honest, we don't know if what's going on with the rest of the world. We don't know if the entire world is like this, if people are gone now. And it's been left to these guys. That's insane. I'm hoping those sounds imply that there's still some life on Earth outside of Nanaki and his race and other more animal types. Okay, so once I completed the game, it completely exited the game. For a second I thought my recording wasn't going to work, but it did. So we're all good. I can talk more about the game now. So in terms of our protagonist, Cloud, I thought he was a really interesting, really good protagonist because when you start the game, there's like a, you know, he seems like a very like standard, you know, protagonist. Like you think you know everything about him, you think you know his history, you know his skills, you know, all that kind of stuff. Soldier, first class, all that kind of business. But then as the story unfolds, you realize that not everything is how it seems, and then you go on this wild ride with him where you're not sure about which of his memories are true and which are not, which I thought was really interesting because it's a real trip. Like the scene with Sephiroth where he shows you what happened in Nibelheim, and Tifa on the one hand is like, she seems really suspect, which makes you think, well, Sephiroth is telling the truth. But then on the one hand, because she's unsure herself, there's certain things that she doesn't want to say either. So then you think that Sephiroth is telling the truth, but then obviously as the story unfolds you find out what really happened, because Tifa didn't know that Cloud was the one in the Shinra uniform. And then you find out about Zack and that whole story, and then like how Hojo basically ended up being the guy behind almost this entire thing. So I don't know, like the revelations in this game, the twists and turns of the story, and like the whole science versus magic element, they were all quite interesting to me, and I think they played out in a pretty decent way. I did enjoy that. The one thing about the story which I found kind of confusing was when we were finding out the reveal about Cloud and what truly happened in Nibelheim. I remembered when we went there, Cloud was telling people about what happened 5 years ago, and they were like, what? Nothing like that happened. You know, why would you say things like that and all this kind of stuff? And I remember thinking, but that clearly proves that the Cloud wasn't there 5 years ago and that his memories are not true. Now, I asked about this, and I later found out that apparently everyone in Nibelheim, so for the last 5 years, is apparently actors that have been placed there by the Shinra to mask the fact that, you know, Sephiroth went berserk and destroyed the village and killed everyone there. And I was like, what? Like, when the hell did we find out this information? How do we find out this information? Is that really like a good plot device that we have here? Like, an entire town full of people for the last 5 years are paid actors to hide the truth that it was burnt down by Sephiroth. I thought that was a bit of a weird like storyline choice, but okay. Because, I mean, your head is already kind of mixed up about Cloud's memories. Like, is it true? Is it not? Who is Cloud? What's going on? And then when my mind went back to what happened in Nibelheim, not knowing that they were actors, that just really confused me. It threw me off. But I guess, you know, it still fits in with the story, but it's just a bit of an interesting choice. So, yeah, there was that whole element as well. One thing that this story made me think about is the fact that when we have these kind of tales, we have, you know, the impending doom, we have the world destruction, the world needs saving, our protagonists have to come in and do something huge, and everyone's life is in danger with these kind of stories usually. But when you really come down to it, it really just does come down to one person and one person's will and one person's sense of morality, one person's desire, etc. So what I liked was the fact that Cloud had that little speech where he basically said that, yes, okay, we all want to save the planet, but why are we saving it? Like, who are we saving it for? Because, of course, you know, all of us that have at least some kind of moral compass will want to be, you know, protecting the world and saving the world for our fellow human being. But when we really get down to it, how much do we actually care about the human beings that we're never ever going to see, that we're never going to interact with, that we're never going to get to know, that we're never going to get to love as people, etc., etc. So Cloud is saying, yes, of course, we have a duty to our fellow human being to protect the planet, but deep down, like on an individual level, who are you saving the planet for? Who is it that makes this planet worth living on for you? Because everybody needs somebody, right? Like, no one is an island. So the fact that Cloud made it clear that this isn't just some heroic, selfless thing that everybody's just doing for the good of the planet and for no other reason, I thought it was nice that he kind of acknowledged the fact that we're all doing this for someone as well. We all have that special someone, or those special people in our lives that we want to save the planet for, so we can continue to share this life experience with these people. So both from like the good side and the bad side, I think that's something that the game ended up dealing with quite well, because for the good guys we had the Cloud speech that I just mentioned and that whole element of the thing, and of course for antagonists the individualistic element is a lot easier to see. It's a lot more transparent. But even with this situation, like, because we can kind of view Sephiroth as almost like we've got like a Frankenstein's monster situation. So we've got like Hojo as Frankenstein and Sephiroth as Frankenstein's monster here, because games like this really make it clear to me that even though it's a fictional tale, it stems from real minds, and people that are trying to tell a story that's going to affect people in a real way. And you know, for me, I believe that no person is born evil, and I'm pretty sure most of us agree on that. Pretty much all of us agree on that, but we're all just a product of our environments. If you think of Sephiroth as an antagonist and what he's trying to do, all that kind of stuff, his motives, yes, they're kind of evil. He wants to basically destroy the planet in order to be able to heal it afterwards, become one with, you know, the life stream, and basically become like a god. So these are kind of quite classic things that we see in Final Fantasy games. But the more we learn about his backstory, the more we learn about like what Hojo did, you know, injecting Lucretia with the Genova cells. So Sephiroth was born with Genova cells. Sephiroth believing a false history about himself, which kind of mirrors what Cloud knew about himself in the later stages of the game. Then he finds out what he thinks is his true nature about like the Cetra, and he's the last Cetra and all that kind of stuff. And then he goes on like a wild rampage, and it turns out that that's not even true. He doesn't even really know who his father is, and all this kind of business. So when you think about it, Hojo quite literally created a monster out of his kind of greed for scientific advancement. Hojo is the true, he's like the puppet master here. And when you look at his personal motivations and his goals, his is just a very individualistic quest for scientific knowledge and discovery at whatever cost. And if you look at it in that sense, like scientific advancement is ultimately a great thing for humanity, but if it's kind of matched with a more evil, like maniacal obsession of the type that Hojo has, it can ultimately be very damaging for the planet. So science is like a wonder and like an incredible way for humans to advance and understand the universe better, but like everything, it needs some kind of morality and some kind of balance, otherwise it can go too far. And we've seen humanity flirt with such ideas before when we've had things like the Manhattan Project. So the more like the general morality that we all share starts to remove itself from the equation, and we have people's just individual desires and pursuits and lack of value for their fellow human being. Because someone like Hojo, he doesn't care about people other than himself. Like for him, people, you know, we inhabit this planet, we're all just a bunch of cells, we're all just scientific information waiting to be discovered or waiting to be used and thrown away for the betterment of science. It's kind of crazy. Like, I don't think there's been too many Final Fantasies where I can make similar parallels here. Like, Hojo doesn't care about like politics or, you know, individual power. I don't think he wants to do it because he wants to become a god or whatever, like Sephiroth does. It's just it's a really interesting perspective, and he's a very, very interesting character. And the whole idea of just individuals and their desires and their wants, and how that compares to what's going on in the bigger picture, was something I really enjoyed about Final Fantasy VII's story. And in terms of like the rest of the characters, I will go back to what I mentioned previously about the whole like team spirit and camaraderie thing. It definitely came together more towards like the mid to latter part of the second disc. And obviously, like the third disc, once we're all inside the North Crater, you had like those classic moments where everybody had their like final lines, and like we had the whole team thing going on. Would I say that in that sense it was one of the better Final Fantasies of the series? I'd probably say no. I think there were plenty of Final Fantasies that did the whole like, you know, experiencing the story together as a team, the team's bond growing and that camaraderie and all that kind of thing. I think there were Final Fantasy games that did that better. But now that I've got to the end of the game, I definitely don't think it's like some kind of disaster or something I'm really like bugged about, something I really didn't like. But it's definitely something that stuck in my mind as like a little bit of a negative point. But I guess what they did do well was the fact that they did give everybody their moments in the story on an individual level. Like if you're talking about Barrett, I thought Barrett's story was really, really good. I think Barrett felt to me as someone that's like a legendary character in the Final Fantasy universe, but just in terms of like his story and everything he has to go through and the stuff that he has to wrestle with mentally, like with the whole Avalanche and the things that he's done for Avalanche, and his relationship with Dyne, what happened with them and all that kind of stuff. It's like, that guy has been through the wars and he has had to wrestle with some really, really terrible things like in his life, and all the way up until the end, like there's stuff that he has to live with for the rest of his life. And I think in that sense, like his look, you know, his gun arm, all that kind of stuff is very iconic. But in terms of a character and his arc and his story, I think he's one of the best like characters that I've encountered in Final Fantasy. I think he's really, really cool in that sense as well. So Barrett's moments I thought were really, really good. I think Nanaki is another standout. Cosmo Canyon, his whole story with his father. Bugenhagen, you know, I always love like the old kind of wise characters in these games. They're always great to have to kind of break up the youthful energy of the party. Even though Bugenhagen is plenty energetic, but in terms of like his wisdom and the way he like breaks down certain things and presents the story and that kind of thing, I thought that was a great segment of the game. Cosmo Canyon is just a beautiful area, and that whole like the Nanaki arc I thought was really good. I thought Wutai was a lot of fun because Yuffie is not quite the same, is not really of the same mold as everybody else, and sometimes it feels out of place like within the story. But once you go to Wutai and you experience the events there, I think it's very well catered to Yuffie's character and what she's about. And you know, there's some pretty like funny moments in there as well, alongside the more like serious like battles and all that kind of thing. So I thought Yuffie's Wutai segment was really good as well. Vincent, I think I read some comments about people saying that Vincent was someone that was meant to be a main party member, but they didn't have time to fully implement him, and they just made him like an optional character instead. So when I think of it in that sense, I think like yes, you know, perfectly fine, but I'm also a little bit disappointed that we didn't get a little bit more out of Vincent. I would have loved for him to be genuinely a main character and have much more of a voluntary input into like the important story segments of the game, because he's got a lot of interesting things to say. He has a lot of interesting history. He's seen a lot of interesting things. You know, he is the guy who's, you know, the love of his life ended up having a kid with Hojo, who had become Sephiroth. I mean, that's pretty insane. And given like what we've seen of Sephiroth's, of Vincent's character and all that kind of stuff, it would have been nice to have him be like really like one of the more core members of the team. But I guess, you know, again, it's developmental and technical limitations, so I can't knock the game too much for that. And that goes back to the whole thing about like the camaraderie and all that kind of stuff. There were moments in the story where important things were happening, where the entire cast should have been there, but it was only the party members that you selected. And again, that's probably a technical limitation as well, like having all the characters there at once is not really applicable to all of the areas and all the scenes that we experience. So again, I'm not gonna like, you know, bash it for that, but it's just something that I felt, you know, in an ideal world, like if you're remaking the game, for example, hint hint, that's something that I'm hoping will definitely be explored and implemented in a much better way than it was in this game. So like people like Bugenhagen, I thought they had some really good moments, like the way they broke certain things down, and like their discussions about science and magic and all that kind of stuff. I'm always a sucker for this kind of thing, because I always like to try and explore, you know, ideas that go beyond just science and maths and all that kind of stuff. Even though I love that kind of side of things too, I think this game had a nice balance with that kind of stuff. We had the space scene, so you guys know I love space and all that kind of stuff. Final Fantasy VIII, I think, did it better from like the whole the drama perspective. The space segment of Final Fantasy VIII was just incredible for me, just like one of the most memorable Final Fantasy moments of all time. But Final Fantasy VII was pretty good as well, and seeing Cid kind of achieve his dream of space travel and all that kind of stuff, and what happened with Shera and the way they kind of reconciled, and Cid finally, you know, started to behave in a more appropriate manner towards her and stuff. I think it was a really good segment, and Cid's growth really interesting. So overall, I definitely enjoyed the story, and I have no like major complaints about it. I would say it's more like, you know, small bits here and there to do with like the camaraderie and all that kind of stuff that I've talked about already. In terms of the remake, because I feel like all of the right ingredients are in this story and in this game, the remake does have the potential to truly be a modern day masterpiece. So Final Fantasy 13 and 15, I would say, are like the quote-unquote modern Final Fantasy, like the most modern ones. I would say anything from the PS3 era onwards is, in my mind, a more modern Final Fantasy title. Final Fantasy 13, I'm not going to go too much into it, but I think it's a pretty decent game. And Final Fantasy 15 is good at best for me. So in terms of like a modern day masterpiece, we haven't really had one from Square Enix. So I feel like the remake definitely has a chance to be that game. So I'm really kind of looking forward to seeing the remake, and I do have high hopes for it, having completed the original. So yeah, just all in all, I mean, soundtrack enjoyed, gameplay I enjoyed, the characters I enjoyed, the antagonist I really enjoyed, the world map I thought was pretty good, again, for the time in which the game was made. It's pretty big, it has pretty decent variety. We've still got some post-game things to do, so there's places to visit, there's extra bosses to fight, there's more summons to get. There was plenty of summons in the game. I didn't use them in case it turned into too much of a summon spam, but I got to show you guys all of them pretty much. There's at least one more that I need to get, but we'll get to that one a little bit later. So in terms of content, there's plenty of content here for people to enjoy as well. So it's definitely got enough depth as a game as well. That's something I can't criticize it for. In terms of like difficulty, I would say for me, it's not always the easiest thing to judge a game on, because like nowadays I'm very experienced with the Final Fantasy games. I know how they work and all that kind of stuff. Again, I try my best to put myself in the shoes of someone that would have played this like in 1997 when it first came out. And when I think of it that way, probably a lot of people who played Final Fantasy VII hadn't played a Final Fantasy game before. And they certainly hadn't played one on PS1, because that wouldn't have been possible. And I think when you think of it in those terms, I think the difficulty was perfectly fine. For me, because obviously I want to do my best to strike a balance between showing you guys what's available in the game, so what are the materials, what are the equipments and all that kind of stuff. I've obviously made sure that I've gotten everything that's good in the game. I mean, if I was doing this completely blind, no guide whatsoever, no nothing, then there might have been certain things that would have been more difficult for me to do. But because I pretty much got everything that I could have gotten, that definitely made the game easier. And when you pair that with my general experience in the Final Fantasy series, and the fact that I did a few little side quests and stuff before I got to the end of the game, it's understandable that I found the end a little bit more easier than probably a lot of people did when they first played the game. But because, as I mentioned right at the start of the playlist, this was not a blind playthrough, it never would have been. It's clear from the channel that because I have the movie version, I've played the game before, so it wasn't going to be the same type of run as Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age, Final Fantasy IX, etc. So in terms of striking a balance, I did my best. Story-wise, I was very hazy on a lot of the things. Gameplay-wise, there were areas I hadn't been to before, materials I'd never used before, things I'd never gotten before. So it was like a 50-50 in terms of finding new things, exploring new things, seeing new things, but also having a grasp on like the gameplay, mechanics and story from the last time I played. So I did my best to do it justice. I hope you guys enjoyed it. From here onwards, what to expect? From here onwards, what I'm going to do is have some bonus episodes where we are going to be doing some of the side questy things I haven't yet done. We have Ultima Weapon to defeat, we have Emerald Weapon to defeat, and we have Ruby Weapon to defeat. So that's like one set of things to do. Alongside that, I have the ultimate weapons I need to get for everybody. I need to get everybody's final limit breaks as well. If there's any materials that I haven't got, I need to get those, including a summon material that I know I definitely haven't gotten. I need to get everyone's final limit breaks as well, which is another thing to add to the list. I think other than that, I might show one or two like alternate scenes I haven't shown you guys throughout the game. So stuff like Don Corneo's mansion, like near the start of the game, there were a few alternatives that I could have shown for that you guys didn't get to see. So I'll try to explore some of that as well. So there's still plenty to come from this playlist, including some hopefully really cool boss battles. So you guys can look forward to seeing that. But so far, definitely had a really good time with Final Fantasy VII. I'm really happy that it didn't like disappoint me, because of course there is going to be major hype when it's known as the greatest Final Fantasy of all time, and it has such a passionate and knowledgeable fan base about the game. But definitely did not disappoint. Had a really good time. Where would I rank it among all of my Final Fantasy experiences? Oof. It's very hard to say. It's definitely up there with the Final Fantasy VIIIs and the Final Fantasy IXs of the world. For me, it's so hard to decide between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX that having Final Fantasy VII in there as well has really like thrown a spanner in the works. It's really hard to say. I mean, I'm not going to commit to anything. I'm gonna remain on the fence about this because it's just too hard, and especially when you've made it to the end of a game, and you know your feelings and your memories about that game are at their most potent. It's very hard to rank it among the other ones, but I definitely do put it among like the quote-unquote pantheon of best Final Fantasy games. So if we're talking about what some of the best Final Fantasy games, it's definitely up there with 8, 9, and 10 for me. So I think I can definitely, like in my own mind, I could definitely say that 7, 8, 9, and 10 are like for me the top tier of Final Fantasy games of the ones I've played so far. Then for me it takes a step down, like when we're talking about Final Fantasy 13, 12, 15, 10-2, those kind of games, those are of a lower tier than these top 4. So Final Fantasy 7 for me definitely makes it onto like the top tier of Final Fantasy games I've played up until this point. Maybe once the remake comes out as well, if they nail it, if they really get it right, then maybe that will cement Final Fantasy 7's place as like genuinely one of my all-time favorites, but it's definitely up there for now. So that's it, guys. That's been the walkthrough. Thank you to everybody that's been riding with me so far. It's been another long playlist. I try my best to try and keep both sides happy, because I know a lot of people watching this know the game really well. They know it inside out, and they want to see me show them like everything that I can show them about the game. And I've done my best to do that to the best of my abilities, while trying to retain like a slightly more casual flavor, you know, still being quite blind, not taking it too kind of, not treating it as like some kind of, you know, specific guide where I'm only here to show you how to do things, but to also enjoy the story, enjoy the experience, bits that I don't know about, to go in there blind and just to see what happens, and to wing certain sections of the game, etc. So I've done my best to strike a balance. It's never going to be perfect. Some people are going to be like, oh, I wish you showed a few more things. Some people are going to be like, oh, I wish it was a bit more blind. I prefer it when you play even more blindly than you played this game. But, you know, I did my best, and I hope you guys enjoyed it regardless. So that's all I got for now. Thank you to everybody who's watched, who's stuck around, and who's supported the series. There'll be more coming from this, and I will see you guys soon for more Final Fantasy VII. Thanks for watching. Take care.